The explosion tore through the silence at both 3:14 hours, a white-hot flash that turned midnight into noon for exactly 3 seconds before plunging Hangar Bay 7 back into darkness. James Carter's eyes snapped open on the cot he'd dragged into the corner workspace months ago, his body already moving before his brain caught up nearly 7 decades of life, compressed into pure survival instinct. The ringing in his ears fought against the wail of base alarms, and through the haze of concrete dust, he could see the twisted remains of what had been a Zephyrian chestplate on his primary workbench, now a sculpture of molten alloys and shattered biomechanical threading. His hands found the emergency lighting panel by muscle memory, flooding the bay with harsh red illumination that painted everything in shades of warning. The armor piece had been intact 2 hours ago when he'd photographed it for his repair log cataloging microfractures that didn't match any combat pattern he'd seen in 43 months of working exclusively on alien equipment. Now it was evidence of something far worse than neglect or battlefield damage. James moved to the wreckage with the careful steps of a man who'd survived 3 wars by assuming every quiet moment was just a prelude to violence. His scanner, somehow still functional on the adjacent bench, picked up residual energy signatures that made his stomach tighten. Royal-grade demolition compound, the kind that required clearances, James had seen mentioned exactly once in classified briefings about preventing assassination attempts on high-value alien dignitaries. The device had been nested inside the armor's power coupling, designed to detonate during the next activation sequence. Whoever owned this armor was supposed to die the moment they sealed the chestplate. The hangar's main entrance exploded inward before James could process the full implications. Blast doors that weighed 3 tons each, buckling like cardboard under focused plasma charges. A figure materialized through the smoke, moving with the fluid grace that marked Zephyrian warriors, even when they were trying to look human. The weapon in her hands tracked left and right with professional efficiency, blue skin visible where her civilian jacket had torn during what must have been a sprint across half the base. Commander Sarah, or at least that's what her identification tags claimed, though James had learned months ago that Zephyrians didn't hand out their real names to humans unless those humans had earned something beyond mere competence. She'd brought him 17 different armor sets for repair over the past year, each one showing damage that told stories about fights in places the official reports never mentioned. This was the first time she'd ever arrived while he was still working. Her amber eyes locked onto him with an intensity that would have made most men step back. James held his ground, raising both hands slowly to shoulder height, aware that from her perspective, he was standing over a demolished piece of equipment that belonged to her, covered in concrete dust and holding a scanner that probably looked a lot like a detonator to someone running on adrenaline and paranoia. "Before you shoot," he said, voice steady, despite the ringing still echoing through his skull, "check the energy signature on your armor piece. Someone planted a bomb in the power coupling 3 days ago, probably when it was in secure storage. I found it during the diagnostic scan 2 hours ago and was trying to figure out how to disable it when it went off anyway." Sarah's weapon didn't waver, but her gaze flicked to the scanner in his hand, then to the wreckage, then back to his face. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied some internal calculation, because the plasma rifle lowered exactly 30 degrees, still ready, but no longer aimed at his center mass. "You found an assassination device," she said, and it wasn't a question. "Found one that was set for remote detonation, which means whoever planted it knew I was getting too close." James nodded toward the melted armor fragments. "That chest plate has Royal Zephyrian insignia embedded in the molecular structure. I've worked on 200 alien armor sets, and I've never seen that particular alloy composition. Whoever you really are, Commander, someone very badly wants you dead." The base alarm system chose that moment to escalate from general alert to full combat stations, automated voices echoing through corridors, announcing an unspecified security breach. Sarah's head tilted slightly, a gesture James had learned meant she was listening to something on a frequency his merely human ears couldn't detect. Whatever she heard made her jaw tighten. "The assassin is still on base. Security thinks you're the bomber." She moved toward him with purpose, holstering the rifle and pulling a compact device from her jacket. "This hangar is about to be sealed with both of us inside while they sort out what happened. Which gives whoever planted that bomb exactly what they want: you trapped in an isolated space with no witnesses." James was already moving, grabbing the go bag he kept under his cot for emergencies that he'd always assumed would involve fire, or structural collapse, not covert warfare. Medical Bay has ventilation shafts wide enough for human passage. I used them 6 months ago when a plasma conduit failed and filled this whole section with toxic fume. Sarah stared at him for exactly 2 seconds, calculating odds and angles with computer precision. Then she nodded once, sharp and decisive. Lead. They ran. The ventilation shaft was exactly where James remembered it, hidden behind a supply locker that required 2 people to move under normal circumstances, and one desperate man with decades of regret fueling his muscles to shift alone when necessary. Sarah helped without being asked, her Zephyrian strength making the task almost effortless, and then they were inside the narrow passage, crawling through darkness, with only the red emergency lighting bleeding through occasional grates to mark their progress. "You move like someone who's done this before," Sarah said from behind him, her voice carrying that peculiar quality Zephyrian vocal cords gave human languages, like she was speaking through water and crystal simultaneously. "Combat medic, first Gulf War. Saved 23 lives in 4 months." James kept his focus on the shaft ahead, counting intersections by memory. "Lost number 24 because I was on a supply run when the field hospital got hit. Private Rodriguez, 19 years old, scared bleeding from shrapnel wounds while I was 3 clicks away, loading medical supplies. Spent the next 40 years making sure I never missed another equipment fault that could have been caught with proper attention." Sarah's hand touched his shoulder, gentle, despite the cramped space, and when James glanced back, her expression held something that looked like recognition. "I understand carrying the dead," she said quietly. "It's heavier than carrying the living." They reached the medical bay's access point without further conversation, dropping into a supply closet that smelled of antiseptic and recycled air. Sarah moved immediately to the door, listening, then cracked it open just enough to confirm the corridor beyond was empty. The base was on full lockdown, which meant most personnel would be at combat stations or sealed in their quarters waiting for the all-clear that wouldn't come until security finished investigating an explosion that had probably already been classified as an attempted assassination. James was pulling medical supplies from the nearest cabinet, by habit loading his bag with trauma kits and emergency stims, while his brain caught up to what his hands already knew they'd need. Sarah watched him work with an expression that might have been approval, or might have been calculation, or might have been both. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "Because someone tried to kill you with a brain sophisticated enough to bypass Alliance security, which means this isn't about you personally, it's about your position." James sealed the bag and met her gaze directly. "And because I've learned the difference between following regulations and doing what's right. Sometimes those things align, tonight they don't." Sarah studied him for another long moment, then reached up to touch something at her collar. The civilian jacket shimmered and fell away, revealing combat armor underneath. That was definitely not standard Alliance issue. The biomechanical threading glowed faintly in the dim emergency lighting patterns that seemed to shift and flow like living circuits, and when James looked closer, he could see the same royal insignia he'd identified in the molecular scan, except this time it was visible on the surface, proclaiming an identity that no mere commander would ever wear. "My name is Serafina Vex," she said, and there was weight in those words that went beyond simple introduction. "Queen of the Zephyrian Protectorate. 3 years ago, I left my throne to fight on the front lines because I couldn't ask my people to die for causes I wasn't willing to bleed for myself. My council believes I'm operating from a secured command post deep in Alliance space. In reality, I've been serving as Commander Sarah at forward operating bases across 6 systems." James processed this information with the same methodical calm he'd used to process incoming casualties during the war, separating emotion from facts, understanding from reaction. A queen who'd abandoned her throne to fight as a common soldier. A leader who'd chosen the battlefield over the palace. Someone who'd made the same choice James had made when he'd requested assignment to Fort Meridian instead of retiring to some civilian life that would have been comfortable and meaningless and empty. "How many people know?" he asked. 4. My personal guard, all dead now, killed in the ambush that made me realize I couldn't rule from a palace and expect to understand what my military actually needed. My chief advisor who coordinates the deception. And now you." Serafina's gaze held his. "The question's what you'll do with that information." "Well, same thing I'd do if you were Rodriguez, bleeding out on a table everything I can to keep you alive." James moved to the medical bay's main terminal, fingers flying across the interface with speed that surprised even him. That bomb was remotely detonated when you approached the hangar, which means someone was watching, waiting. They knew you'd come for the armor when they sent whatever fake emergency triggered your response. We need to find out who had access to both the armor storage and your movement schedule. The terminal flickered as James pulled up security logs, his technician clearances giving him access to systems that most enlisted personnel never even knew existed. Serafina moved beside him, her hands dancing across a secondary interface, pulling data streams that required biometric authorization James definitely didn't have. Together, they painted a picture of the past 72 hours, tracking the chest plate from secure storage through standard inspection protocols to James's workbench, noting every person who'd been logged in the vicinity. One name appeared with suspicious frequency: Lieutenant Krell Zephyrian, liaison officer assigned to coordinate between Alliance Command and visiting dignitaries from the Protectorate. He'd been present when the armor was transferred from storage. He'd checked the hangar logs twice in the past 24 hours. And according to the current security feeds, he was currently leading a 3-person squad toward the medical bay weapons active, moving with the careful precision of soldiers who expected to find their target already trapped. "Your council wants you back," James said, understanding clicking into place. "Not because they care about your safety, because they can't control you out here. Krell isn't trying to kill you. He's trying to force you to reveal yourself, to choose between maintaining your cover and staying alive." Serafina's expression went cold, the warmth James had seen it earlier vanishing behind a mask of royal authority that probably terrified entire planetary assemblies. "Then we make sure he learns why Zephyrian queens are chosen for their tactical capability, not their bloodline." She pulled a compact device from her armor's utility compartment, something that looked like a combination of medical scanner and communications jammer. "How well do you know this facility's infrastructure?" "Well enough to know that Medical Bay connects to the main vehicle depot through a maintenance tunnel that's technically off limits, but never actually locked." James was already moving toward the storage closet at the back of the bay, the one marked "Authorized Personnel Only" that he'd ignored approximately 50 times in the past year. And that Alliance security protocols assume intruders will try to escape the base, not head deeper inside to gather evidence. They were through the tunnel and approaching the intelligence center before Krell's squad breached the medical bay alarms, screaming behind them as base security finally registered that their target wasn't where they had expected. The intelligence center's server room required biometric access that James technically shouldn't have had, except he'd spent 3 years maintaining the facility's technical infrastructure and had learned early that having unrestricted access made emergency repairs significantly easier. His palm print opened the door without triggering any alerts, and they were inside, surrounded by humming processors and data storage arrays that held every communication that passed through Fort Meridian's network. Krell's transmissions would be encrypted, Serafina said, already moving toward a terminal with purposeful efficiency. "Encrypted using Zephyrian military protocols that I've been studying specifically because I wanted to understand the equipment I was repairing." James pulled up a secondary interface, fingers dancing across controls while lines of code scrolled past. "He's good, but he's not perfect. He left fragments in the buffer systems because he assumed Alliance technicians wouldn't know how to recognize Zephyrian data structures. They worked in synchronized silence, James isolating communication fragments while Serafina decoded the encryption, pulling together evidence of conspiracy that spanned 3 years and multiple star systems. Messages between Krell and High Counselor Vex coordinating the assassination attempt. Communications with other Zephyrian military officers discussing extraction plans if the assassination failed. Plans for a controlled transition that would remove Serafina from power while maintaining the appearance of legitimate succession. It was all there, documented in meticulous detail by conspirators who'd never imagined that a human technician and a queen pretending to be a commander would be capable of penetrating security systems designed to be impenetrable. The door opened behind them and Lieutenant Krell walked in, flanked by 2 Zephyrian guards, whose weapons were already raised and aimed with professional precision. "Your Majesty," Krell said, and there was mockery in how he used the title, "you've made this significantly more complicated than it needed to be. The Council's offer was generous return to Zephyria for a formal abdication in exchange for your life and freedom. Instead, you choose to run to hide with this human technician to make yourself look exactly as unstable and unfit as High Counselor Vex has been claiming." Serafina straightened slowly, and James watched her transformation from wounded fugitive to something that radiated authority like heat from a forge. She wasn't Commander Sarah anymore, wasn't even pretending to be anything other than what she'd always been beneath the disguise. The Council's offer was conditional abdication in exchange for my life, she said, voice carrying harmonics that made even Krell's guards tense. Which means you already intended to kill me if I refused. This was never about returning me to Zephyria Lieutenant. This was about removing me from power while maintaining plausible deniability about how it happened. Does it matter? Krell gestured with his sidearm, a casual motion that spoke to comfort with violence. You're here isolated with only one human for protection. Even if you've gathered evidence, you won't live to present it. James had been calculating angles and distances while Krell talked combat instincts, evaluating the tactical situation with methodical precision. Two guards, both focused primarily on Serafina weapons steady, but positioned for a quick execution rather than a sustained firefight. Krell, overconfident, standing too close to the door controls, assuming that an aging technician posed no threat worth accounting for. He triggered the device still concealed in his pocket, the one Serafina had used earlier, to jam communications, except James had reconfigured it during their escape to broadcast on Emergency Alliance frequencies. The Intelligence Center's security protocols interpreted the signal as evidence of an active intrusion, sealing blast doors and activating internal countermeasures that included a very loud alarm and deployment of riot control measures designed to disorient intruders. The guards faltered combat training, disrupted by sudden chaos, and Serafina moved with speed that shouldn't have been possible for someone who'd been running for hours. She hit the first guard with biomechanically enhanced strength that sent him crashing into server arrays, then pivoted to disarm the second before he could adjust his aim. Krell tried to bring his weapon to bear, but James was already moving decades of pent-up guilt and determination focused into tackling the lieutenant with force that probably damaged James's shoulder but definitely disrupted Krell's shot. They struggled for control of the weapon, Krell stronger, but James angrier, fueled by memories of every soldier he'd failed to save and every night he'd spent wondering if being a good technician was enough to balance the scales. The gun discharged twice plasma bolts that scorched equipment and filled the air with ozone, and then Serafina was there pulling Krell away with hands that could crush reinforced alloys. Alliance security burst into the server room 30 seconds later, weapons drawn, finding a scene that would require extensive reports and probably multiple investigations. Lieutenant Krell restrained by a woman they'd been told was Commander Sarah, two Zephyrian guards unconscious, and James Carter, unremarkable technician, standing beside a terminal that displayed evidence of conspiracy and assassination that would reshape diplomatic relations across three sectors. General Morrison arrived within minutes, his expression showing the particular weariness of senior officers who just discovered that political complications were about to make his next month absolutely miserable. He listened while Serafina explained, her voice carrying royal authority that left no room for interruption. Listened while she activated a broadcast device, flooding Alliance communication networks with her true identity and biometric confirmation that Queen Serafina of the Zephyrian Protectorate was alive, present, and demanding protection under diplomatic treaty. Listened while she formally accused High Counselor Vex of orchestrating assassination and coup, presenting evidence that even Alliance legal specialists would have to acknowledge as legitimate and actionable. Morrison looked at James once during the explanation, a long considering stare that promised conversations about regulations and protocols, and probably a lot of questions about exactly how a maintenance technician had acquired the skills and equipment to help a queen infiltrate his facility and expose a conspiracy. But that would come later. Right now he had a diplomatic incident to manage and a queen to protect, and James Carter was just going to be one more complication in a situation that had already gone far beyond standard military operations. Morrison placed them both in protective custody while Alliance security processed the arrests and secured the evidence they'd gathered. It was technically detention, but felt more like exhausted relief sitting in a conference room with guards posted outside while the general coordinated with the Alliance command about how to handle a situation that had approximately zero precedent in diplomatic protocols. You realize, Morrison said after the initial chaos settled, that you've both violated enough regulations to keep military lawyers employed for the next decade. I realize that someone tried to kill Queen Serafina with a bomb planted in equipment I was responsible for maintaining. James replied, too tired to be diplomatic. Everything else was just trying to keep her alive long enough to expose who ordered it, and bringing her into a secured intelligence facility to steal classified communications, gathering evidence of conspiracy while the conspirators were actively trying to complete their assassination. Sir. James met Morrison's stare without flinching. If proper channels had been functional, I would have used them. But Lieutenant Krell was leading the security response, which meant reporting through proper channels would have been reporting directly to the people trying to kill her. Morrison was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. Alliance Command is convening an emergency session to address Queen Seraphina's accusations. The Zephyrian Planetary Council is demanding her immediate return to face abdication proceedings. High Counselor Vex is claiming she's been compromised by extended exposure to human culture. He paused. You're officially reassigned as technical liaison to the Zephyrian investigation, reporting directly to me. That gives you clearance to access whatever evidence you need and authorization to work with Her Majesty on security assessments. It also means that if this goes sideways, we both end our careers explaining to committees why we decided regulations were optional. James spent the next 18 hours in what Morrison euphemistically called protective observation, which translated to a reasonably comfortable room with guards outside and enough coffee to keep him functional, despite exhaustion that went bone deep. Corporal Danny Hayes found him there, young face flushed with the kind of concern that made James simultaneously proud and uncomfortable. Sir, they said you were arrested. They said you helped a Zephyrian fugitive steal classified data. Danny's words tumbled out fast, overlapping. I told them that was impossible, that you'd never betray Alliance protocols. But then I saw the security footage and I helped Queen Seraphina survive an assassination attempt, James interrupted, keeping his voice level. Everything else is administrative complications that don't concern you. Queen, Danny's expression cycled through confusion, realization, and something close to awe. Commander Sarah is actually Queen Seraphina, the one who disappeared 3 years ago, and you knew. I found out approximately 12 hours ago, same time someone tried to kill her with a bomb planted in armor I was repairing. James gestured to the empty chair. Sit down before you fall down, Hayes, and stop calling me sir. Danny sat, but his eyes never left James's face, searching for answers to questions he probably hadn't even formulated yet. The equipment in your workshop, the modifications you've been teaching me, you've been preparing for something like this. I've been preparing to be useful when everything goes wrong, because experience teaches that everything always goes wrong eventually. James took another sip of coffee that had gone cold. What I wasn't preparing for was getting involved in Zephyrian royal politics. But you helped her anyway. She needed help. I had skills she needed. Basic combat medic arithmetic. You use what you have to save who you can. James met Danny's eyes directly. Now you need to decide if you're going to distance yourself from this situation for the sake of your career, or if you're going to accept that your mentor has significantly more complicated loyalties than standard Alliance protocols prefer. Danny didn't hesitate. You taught me that a technician's job is to keep soldiers alive by making sure their equipment doesn't fail them. If helping Queen Seraphina means preventing war or coup or whatever political nightmare is happening, that's the same job at a bigger scale. Danny straightened in his chair. Whatever you need, I'm in. James felt something shift in his chest, pride mixed with concern, mixed with the recognition that he'd somehow acquired responsibility for this kid's future. Then the first thing I need is for you to access the armor storage logs from the past 72 hours, James said, making the decision to trust. Krell had help planting that bomb, someone with access to royal armor storage and security clearances high enough to bypass standard inspection protocols. Find me names. Danny nodded and was gone, leaving James alone with cold coffee and the growing certainty that the next few days would determine whether he'd made the right choice or just dragged a promising young technician into political quicksand. Morrison returned 6 hours later with news that Alliance Command had formally acknowledged Seraphina's status and was providing diplomatic protection while investigations proceeded. Vex had issued statements claiming his niece was suffering from combat stress and foreign influence, that her accusations were desperate attempts to avoid proper royal succession protocols. The Planetary Council was divided, some members calling for immediate investigation, while others supported Vex's characterization of an unstable queen making unfounded allegations. It's going to come down to evidence, Morrison said. Krell's communications prove conspiracy at the operational level, but they don't definitively tie Vex to giving orders. Right now, it's your word and Queen Seraphina's against a high counselor with 40 years of political influence. Then we need more than communications fragments, James said. We need someone from Vex's network willing to testify about direct orders. Already working on it, we've identified 2 other operatives from Fort Meridian who had suspicious access patterns. Captain Andreas from Supply Logistics and Specialist Yara from Zephyrian Liaison Security. Morrison pulled up holographic profiles. We're bringing them in for questioning, but getting them to flip on Vex will require leverage we don't currently have. Or we give them an opportunity to complete their mission, Seraphina said from the doorway, having been escorted to the conference room by Alliance security. Vex's people think they've already won because I've been formally identified and Alliance protection is temporary. They'll try again probably within the next 24 hours. When they do, we'll have proof of active conspiracy that even my uncle can't explain away. What followed was the most intense planning session James had experienced since Desert Storm, coordinating with Morrison and Alliance intelligence to create apparent vulnerabilities while maintaining actual security. They would move Seraphina to new quarters that looked more secure, but were actually designed to allow infiltration attempts under controlled observation. They would spread information through carefully selected channels about Alliance Command, considering her extradition to Zephyrian Authority. They would create the appearance of opportunity while preparing to catch whoever took the bait. Captain Andreas made his move at 1900 hours the following day, during shift change when security protocols were theoretically at their weakest. He approached Seraphina's quarters with authorization that looked legitimate, carrying orders that claimed Alliance Command needed her relocated to more secure facilities off base while diplomatic negotiations proceeded. James watched from the security center while Danny tracked Andreas's movement through the facility, noting deviations from standard patrol routes that created isolated corridors where extraction could occur without witnesses. He's good, Danny said quietly, fingers dancing across controls. If we weren't specifically watching for this, he'd get her out of the facility before anyone noticed something was wrong. Good isn't the same as perfect. James highlights the 3 points along Andreas's route where building architecture created natural choke points. He's assuming Alliance security is focused on external threats, not internal extraction. That assumption is about to cost him. They let Andreas reach Seraphina's quarters, let him present his false authorization, and make his practice speech about Alliance Command's concerns for her safety. Let him move her out of the room and into corridors that should have been empty, but were actually lined with Alliance security hidden behind active camouflage systems. Andreas realized something was wrong approximately 30 seconds before the trap closed, training that had kept him alive through multiple combat deployments, finally registering that the silence was too complete, the corridors too empty. He reached for his weapon, but James was already there, emerging from concealment with timing that came from decades of understanding exactly when to act. Captain Andreas, you're under arrest for attempted kidnapping of Allied royalty and conspiracy to commit assassination. James kept his voice level professional. You have the right to remain silent, which I strongly suggest you exercise. Andreas fought which James had expected military training overriding common sense in the face of capture. But Alliance security was prepared for resistance, and within minutes Andreas was restrained while his quarters were being swept for evidence. What they found was significant encrypted communications coordinating with Vex's people in Zephyrian space, detailed plans for extracting Seraphina through civilian transport networks, contingency protocols if extraction failed. It was more evidence, more proof of conspiracy, but still not the direct connection to Vex that would make the accusations impossible to dismiss. He'll claim Andreas acted without authorization, Seraphina said, studying the evidence with focused intensity. He'll sacrifice everyone involved if it means maintaining plausible deniability about his own role. Then we need something that ties directly to Vex, something he can't explain away as subordinate initiative. Morrison looked tired, the kind of exhaustion that came from realizing political situations were about to consume months of his life. What does he want badly enough to expose himself personally? James had been thinking about that question, turning it over with methodical attention. Vex had built a network positioned people carefully over years, orchestrated assassination and extraction attempts with precision that spoke to someone who understood both military operations and political maneuvering. He needs proof that Serafina's been compromised, James said slowly. Proof that 3 years among humans has affected her judgment and made her incapable of prioritizing Zephyrian interest. Right now, he has accusations and speculation. What he needs is evidence that she's formed loyalties that conflict with her responsibilities as queen. Understanding dawned across Serafina's face, followed immediately by something that looked like anger and resignation mixed together. He needs proof that I've formed personal relationships with humans that influence my judgment. She turned to face James directly. He needs evidence that you and I have become more than professional colleagues. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that James had been carefully not examining. The way Serafina had trusted him immediately despite having every reason to suspect his motives. The way he'd thrown away career and safety to protect her without hesitation. Everything that had passed between them in brief conversations and shared danger accumulating into something that definitely wasn't just professional courtesy. Danny made a small sound that might have been surprise, and Morrison's expression suggested he was rapidly recalculating political complications. If Vex publicly accuses you of being compromised by personal relationships with humans, and you deny it, he can use your denial as evidence that you're hiding inappropriate attachments. James worked through the logic carefully. If you acknowledge that we've worked closely and developed mutual respect, he'll twist that into proof that you've abandoned Zephyrian interests for alien influence. So I lose either way. No, we acknowledge exactly what's true, that you've learned to trust people based on competence and character rather than species, and that makes you a better leader, not a compromised one. We make that the story, not the scandal he's hoping for. James, if we do that, you'll be dragged into Zephyrian political hearings. Your life will be examined by people looking for any excuse to claim you're a foreign agent or security threat. Serafina's voice carried genuine concern. Everything you've done will be questioned and twisted. You're not asking, I'm volunteering. James kept his voice steady. Because if Vex thinks personal relationships are weakness, he's wrong. The ability to trust people across species is exactly what Alliance needs in leaders. And proving that is worth whatever consequences come from admitting I trust you, more than proper military protocols suggest I should. Morrison cleared his throat, a sound that carried significant meaning about situations spiraling beyond comfortable control. For the record, I'm officially recommending against any course of action that involves publicly acknowledging personal relationships between Alliance personnel and foreign royalty during active diplomatic crises. He paused. Unofficially, if you're going to do it anyway, at least make sure the evidence you generate is thorough enough to justify the paperwork nightmare. Alliance Command authorized diplomatic transport to Zephyrian space 3 days later, after extracting every possible piece of evidence from Andreas and finalizing security protocols that would protect Serafina while she faced the Planetary Council. Morrison arranged for a full security detail and documentation of everything that had happened at Fort Meridian, building an official record that would support Serafina's accusations while also protecting Alliance interests. Danny insisted on coming despite James's protests about risking his career for someone else's political battle. You taught me that showing up matters more than staying safe, Danny said with the conviction that youth brought to obvious truths. If my mentor is walking into alien political combat, someone needs to watch his back. They departed Fort Meridian at dawn, lifting into skies that were clear and cold, and infinite with possibility. James watched Earth fall away through viewport windows, aware that he might never see this planet again, depending on how Zephyrian politics played out. It should have felt like loss. Instead, it felt like finally moving towards something, instead of just away from failure. The 3-day journey through Alliance space gave James time to process everything that had happened and prepare for whatever came next. Serafina spent hours reviewing evidence and preparing testimony, occasionally taking breaks to sit with James in quiet conversation that ranged from tactical planning to deeper discussions about the weight of carrying the dead and whether redemption was something you earned or just something you chose to believe in. You keep talking about Rodriguez like his death defines you, Serafina said on the second day of travel. But you also saved 23 other soldiers. Doesn't that count for something? It counts for everything and nothing simultaneously, James replied. Every soldier I saved justified the career choice, proved I was doing something meaningful. But Rodriguez's death proved I wasn't good enough, that all the technical skill in the world doesn't matter if you're not present when someone needs you. So you've spent 40 years punishing yourself by being present for everyone else, never allowing yourself to be absent even for legitimate reasons, turning your entire life into penance for one moment when you couldn't save someone. Serafina's voice held understanding without judgment. James, that's not redemption. That's just a different kind of prison. Maybe, but it's a prison where I'm useful, where my presence means people survive who might not otherwise. That feels better than accepting I failed Rodriguez and moving on like his death didn't matter. His death mattered. Your survival matters too. Those things can both be true. The conversation stayed with James through the remainder of the journey, turning over in his mind with the same methodical attention he'd used to diagnose equipment failures. Maybe Serafina was right. Maybe he'd been so focused on preventing the next failure that he'd never actually processed the first one, never allowed himself to accept that sometimes people died despite your best efforts. And that didn't make you a failure. It just made you human. The Zephyrian homeworld appeared on their third day of travel, a blue-green sphere wrapped in clouds that looked remarkably similar to Earth despite evolving completely different biology. Alliance diplomatic protocols required formal announcements before entering planetary space, which meant Vex and the Planetary Council knew they were coming hours before the transport actually reached orbital approach. It meant Serafina's uncle had time to prepare to position allies and craft narratives and make ready all the political weapons he'd been gathering for 3 years. Morrison accompanied them to the planet's surface, insisting that if his people were walking into political combat, then he'd be there to provide command perspective and alliance authority. They were met at the spaceport by Zephyrian royal security, who treated Serafina with the formal deference due her rank, while simultaneously making clear that her movements would be carefully monitored until the Planetary Council completed their investigation. The royal palace was magnificent crystalline architecture that captured light and transformed it into living art, 5 centuries of Zephyrian civilization expressed in structures that seemed to grow from the landscape rather than being imposed upon it. James felt profoundly out of place, a human technician, walking through corridors designed for alien royalty, aware that every Zephyrian they passed was tracking him with expressions that ranged from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. "Ignore them," Serafina said quietly. "They're trying to intimidate you to make you feel unwelcome so you'll request to leave before the council hearing." "I've been intimidated by better." James kept his posture relaxed despite tension coiling in his chest. Combat medics learn early that appearing confident is half of actually being effective. They were given quarters in the palace's diplomatic wing rooms that were technically appropriate for honored guests, but positioned in ways that made surveillance obvious and unsubtle. Danny swept the rooms for listening devices out of habit, finding 3 within the first 10 minutes, and leaving them active because removing them would just prompt installation of better hidden replacements. "They're not even trying to be subtle," Danny muttered. "This is about sending a message that we're not trusted." "Good," Serafina said. "Let them think we're naive enough to believe we have privacy. Meanwhile, we prepare for the council hearing, assuming everything we say and do is being monitored and reported to Vex." The Planetary Council convened the following morning in chambers that had witnessed 5 centuries of governance crystalline walls that captured and refracted light in ways that made the entire space feel alive with ancient authority. 200 council members representing every major clan and military faction on Zephyria, all focused on the human technician who'd accompanied their missing queen home from 3 years of unexplained absence. High Counselor Vex occupied the speaker's platform with the comfortable authority of someone who'd spent 4 decades mastering political theater. He was older than Serafina, blue skin marked with patterns that indicated high clan status, amber eyes sharp with intelligence that had orchestrated conspiracies across multiple star systems. "Queen Serafina returns to us finally after abandoning her sacred responsibilities to pursue personal military ambitions among alien cultures." Vex's voice carried harmonics that made even the translation system sound persuasive. "She brings accusations of conspiracy and assassination supported by evidence gathered while operating under false identity in violation of every protocol that governs royal conduct. And she brings a human advisor, as if our internal political matters require alien judgment to resolve. Serafina stood movement fluid despite exhaustion from travel and preparation. She wore full royal regalia armor that proclaimed her status while carrying the scars of actual combat instead of ceremonial polish. High Counselor Vex speaks of abandonment and protocol violations. I speak of survival and adaptation. Her voice resonated through the chamber with authority that came from leading soldiers instead of just commanding them. 3 years ago, my predecessor was assassinated in these very chambers by conspirators who believed a queen safe behind palace walls was easier to manipulate than one who understood warfare firsthand. I chose to lead from positions where assassination required more effort than poison or blades in darkness. She activated holographic displays that filled the chamber's center with evidence James and Danny had compiled. Communications between Krell and Vex's inner circle, documentation of assassination attempts, records of extraction planning that spanned years of careful positioning. Every council member could see the data verify the authentication codes trace the conspiracy's threads back toward their source. My uncle orchestrated attempts on my life. He positioned operatives in alliance facilities to monitor my movements and create opportunities for extraction or elimination. He planned to force my abdication through public discrediting and private threats, replacing legitimate succession with controlled coup. Serafina's gaze found Vex across the chamber. The only thing he didn't anticipate was that someone might help me survive long enough to expose his conspiracy. Vex's expression remained calm, almost amused. Her Majesty presents evidence of overzealous subordinates acting without authorization, then claims their actions represent coordinated conspiracy reaching the highest levels of government. She offers communications that could be interpreted multiple ways, extraction plans that might simply represent appropriate security protocols for protecting royal assets. He paused, timing perfect. And she does all this while standing beside a human whose influence over her judgment has become so profound that she violates every tradition of royal independence to bring alien perspective into our most sensitive deliberations. The chamber erupted in debate, council members arguing over evidence, interpretation, and political implications, voices overlapping in ways that would have been chaos in human assemblies, but somehow maintained structure through Zephyrian harmonic conventions. James caught fragments about protocol violations and security concerns, accusations that Serafina had been compromised by extended exposure to human culture. Danny stood at James's other side, young-faced, tense with awareness that they were watching political combat that could reshape interstellar alliances. "This is going exactly how Vex planned it," James whispered. "He's letting Serafina present evidence, letting the council debate interpretation, establishing that her accusations are controversial enough to require extended investigation. Then he'll pivot to her judgment being compromised, using me as proof that she can't be trusted." Vex called for order with practiced efficiency, waiting until the chamber quieted before speaking again. "The evidence Queen Serafina presents deserves thorough investigation, which will require months of careful analysis. Until that investigation concludes, we cannot make definitive judgments about conspiracy." He shifted his attention to James. "However, we can make immediate assessments about Her Majesty's current fitness to rule based on decisions demonstrating concerning patterns of judgment." Here it comes, James thought. Queen Serafina operated under false identity for 3 years, deceiving allies about her true authority. She formed close personal relationships with alien military personnel, including the human technician who now stands beside her as advisor on matters of Zephyrian internal politics. She violated security protocols, ignored chain of command, and ultimately brought foreign nationals into the heart of our governmental proceedings. Vex's voice carried manufactured concern. "These are not the actions of a queen who prioritizes her people's welfare above personal preference." Serafina's hand found James's briefly, a gesture so subtle most council members probably missed it, but Vex definitely didn't. "High Counselor Vex claims I've formed inappropriate personal relationships that compromise my judgment. He's correct that I've learned to trust based on competence rather than species. He's wrong that this represents weakness rather than strength." Serafina straightened. "James Carter saved my life multiple times while your operatives were attempting assassination. He helped expose conspiracy while your allies were coordinating extraction. He's proven his loyalty through action, while you've proven your ambition through betrayal. Loyalty to you, perhaps, but what loyalty does he owe Zephyria? What investment does a human technician have in our political stability? Vex spread his hands in reasonable inquiry. Your Majesty trusts him because he protected you personally. That's not judgment, that's emotional compromise. The chamber responded with renewed debate, and James could feel the tide shifting, council members finding firmer ground in concerns about foreign influence than in complex evidence of conspiracy. James made a decision that probably violated diplomatic protocols and definitely exceeded his authority. May I speak? The chamber went silent, 200 council members staring at the human who'd just requested permission to address Zephyrian Royal Assembly. Vex looked momentarily surprised, then pleased. The human advisor wishes to speak on his own behalf. How democratic. Vex gestured permissively. By all means, Technician Carter. Explain why your presence here represents proper judgment rather than compromised priorities. James stepped forward, aware of Seraphina's tension beside him, Morrison's warnings echoing through memory. I'm not here to defend my presence or convince anyone that humans have special insight into Zephyrian governance. I'm here because Queen Seraphina needed someone who could help her survive long enough to expose a conspiracy that threatened civil war. James kept his voice level, factual. High Counselor Vex wants you to believe that her trusting me represents emotional compromise. I want you to consider that her trusting me represents exactly the kind of judgment that kept her alive when your security protocols were compromised by traitors. Bold words from someone with no stake in our political outcomes, Vex said with amusement. You're right that I have no stake in who rules Zephyria, but I have significant stake in preventing wars, which is what your conspiracy would have triggered if Queen Seraphina hadn't survived to expose it. James met Vex's gaze directly. 3 years ago, your predecessor, Queen, was assassinated. Seraphina responded by refusing to be an easy target, by learning to lead from positions where she understood what her military actually needed instead of just issuing orders from palace chambers. You call that abandonment. I call it exactly the kind of adaptation that prevents the next assassination. And her bringing you here, elevating a foreign technician to advisor status on sensitive internal matters, proves she understands that competence matters more than origin, which seems like exactly the thinking that builds strong alliances instead of isolated kingdoms that fall to internal conspiracy. James kept his tone factual despite anger building in his chest. You want this council to believe that trust across species represents weakness. I'm standing here as proof that sometimes trust across species is the only thing preventing catastrophic failure when your own people are betraying you. The chamber erupted again, but the tone had shifted debate now, including voices that questioned whether Vex's concerns were legitimate security issues or political maneuvering. Perhaps we should hear from other witnesses about Queen Seraphina's judgment during her time among Alliance forces, Vex said. General Morrison, you commanded the facility where Her Majesty operated. What assessment can you offer about her conduct? Morrison stood with the careful movement of someone who'd spent decades navigating political minefields. Queen Seraphina served at Fort Meridian for 11 months under the designation Commander Sarah. During that time, she led 17 successful operations, maintained exceptional combat readiness scores, and earned the respect of every soldier who served under her command. Morrison's voice carried authority that came from decades of being listened to. When Lieutenant Krell attempted to extract her through force, she responded with tactical precision that prevented casualties among my personnel while exposing conspiracy that threatened Alliance security. Her judgment was sound. Her priorities were clear. The debate continued for 3 more hours, council members calling witnesses and questioning evidence, building arguments about trust and judgment that would ultimately determine whether Seraphina kept her throne. James stood through all of it, aware that his presence was simultaneously helping and hurting her case. They were escorted back to their quarters after the session adjourned, surrounded by security who were protecting Seraphina while also monitoring to ensure she didn't abuse newly acknowledged authority before formal investigations concluded. James collapsed into a chair, exhaustion crashing over him now that immediate crisis had passed. That went better than I expected, Seraphina said, though her expression suggested she was managing expectations carefully. We've created reasonable doubt about Vex's characterization of my judgment as compromised, but we still don't have definitive proof of his direct involvement in ordering assassination. Which means tomorrow they'll vote on whether to launch formal investigation or accept his explanation that operatives acted without authorization, Morrison said. And if they vote to accept his explanation, they'll demand your abdication pending psychological evaluation. Danny had been monitoring Alliance intelligence feeds during the hearing, and now he looked up with expression that mixed concern and possibility. Sir, there's chatter on encrypted Zephyrian military channels. Someone's requesting immediate transport off-planet. Female Zephyrian claiming to have information about High Counselor Vex's conspiracy, but afraid to come forward while still on Zephyria. He pulled up the intercept. It's Specialist Yara. She's panicking. James exchanged glances with Morrison, understanding clicking into place. She watched what happened to Andreas. She knows we're closing in on Vex's network, and she's scared enough that she's willing to testify if we can get her somewhere safe. James turned to Serafina. If we can bring her here to the council chambers with Alliance protection guaranteeing her safety, she might provide the direct evidence we need, Serafina finished. Evidence that even my uncle can't dismiss as misinterpretation or subordinate initiative. Morrison was already on his communicator, coordinating with Alliance Command about extraction protocols and diplomatic protection for potential witnesses. Within 2 hours, Yara was aboard an Alliance transport being escorted to Zephyrian space under guarantees of immunity in exchange for testimony. The Planetary Council reconvened the following day with the unexpected addition of Specialist Yara as a witness. She stood before the assembly with the defeated posture of someone who'd already accepted that her life, as she knew it, was over, speaking not to save herself, but to unburden conscience or settle scores, or simply because staying silent had become impossible. I was recruited 4 years ago by High Counselor Vex's security chief. The mission was long-term positioning, establish credibility in Alliance service gain, access to sensitive facilities, wait for opportunities to act. Her voice carried resignation that made the words somehow more credible. When Queen Serafina was identified at Fort Meridian, I received direct orders through encrypted channels. Extract her if possible. Eliminate her if extraction failed. Make either option look like Alliance security failure rather than Zephyrian internal conspiracy. These are serious accusations requiring serious proof, Vex said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. I kept every encrypted communication, every order, every contingency plan. Yara pulled a data device from her jacket, holding it up. Authentication codes tied directly to High Counselor Vex's personal security protocols. Orders that couldn't have been issued by subordinates because they required command authority that only exists at the highest governmental levels. She activated the device, and the chamber filled with evidence that made Krell's communications look circumstantial by comparison. Direct orders from Vex to operatives across multiple installations. Detailed planning about forcing Serafina's abdication through public scandal and private threat. Contingency protocols if she survived long enough to expose the conspiracy, including plans to discredit her by emphasizing relationships with humans. Everything documented in Vex's own words, authenticated with protocols that even political allies couldn't explain away. The council erupted in genuine chaos, harmonics clashing as members demanded explanations, and investigations accused Vex directly of treason, and conspiracy called for immediate arrest. Vex tried to maintain control through force of personality and political authority, but momentum had shifted irreversibly. James watched it unfold with detached interest, mission accomplished, observing consequences rather than participating in them. Serafina stood beside him, radiating satisfaction that was probably inappropriate, but entirely understandable. What followed took 6 more hours of debate, council members arguing about proper procedure for investigating sitting high counselors accused of conspiracy and treason. Eventually, they reached consensus that Vex would be suspended from all governmental duties, pending formal inquiry, that Queen Serafina was to be restored to full authority immediately, and that Alliance Command would be formally thanked for their assistance. It was victory wrapped in political courtesy that didn't quite hide how close everything had come to collapsing into civil war. Serafina addressed the council one final time before adjournment. I left this chamber 3 years ago because I couldn't ask soldiers to die for causes I wouldn't bleed for myself. I returned having learned that leadership means understanding your people's reality instead of just commanding from comfortable distance. She gestured toward James. I brought a human advisor not because I've been compromised by foreign influence, but because I've learned that competence and loyalty matter more than origin. If that makes me unfit to rule by traditional standards, then perhaps traditional standards need updating. The council responded with harmonics that seemed to carry approval, or at least acceptance. Serafina had won not just the immediate political battle, but something larger: permission to rule differently than her predecessors. They were escorted to royal quarters that felt more like actual accommodation than comfortable imprisonment, security still present, but atmosphere fundamentally changed now that Serafina's authority had been formally restored. James collapsed into a chair, exhaustion that had been held at bay by adrenaline and necessity finally overwhelming him. Danny sprawled on the floor, already pulling up his tablet to review everything that had happened. Serafina remained standing at the window looking out over her capital city with expression James couldn't quite read. You won, he said, because someone needed to acknowledge it. I survived long enough to expose conspiracy and reclaim authority that was mine by right. That's not winning, that's just preventing immediate disaster. Serafina turned to face him. Now comes the actually difficult part. Ruling a people who've been reminded that their queen considered abandoning them for 3 years. Working with a council that includes members who supported Vex even if they weren't directly involved. Rebuilding trust while implementing changes that will make traditional factions uncomfortable. Sounds like years of complicated political work. Sounds exhausting. She moved away from the window, settling into a chair across from James. The Planetary Council is requiring that I marry within 1 year to secure succession. They claim it's about stability and continuity. Really, it's about ensuring I have obligations that keep me focused on Zephyrian interests. James felt something cold settle in his chest. They want you married to Zephyrian nobility, someone whose loyalty and lineage are unquestionable. He kept his voice level, which means whatever this is between us needs to end before it becomes additional ammunition for people who think you've been compromised. That's what political wisdom suggests. Serafina's gaze held his. And any appearance of inappropriate attachment to humans, select an appropriate consort from approved clan alliances, demonstrate that my time among aliens didn't fundamentally change my priorities. But I didn't spend 3 years fighting on front lines just to return and let political pressure dictate how I live. I didn't survive assassination attempts and conspiracy just to marry someone chosen for clan advantage instead of actual partnership. Serafina leaned forward. And I didn't bring you here just to use your testimony and then dismiss you once the immediate crisis passed. Danny made a small sound that might have been surprise, and James felt awareness shifting. Serafina, I'm nearly 70 years old. I'm human, which means I have maybe 20 years left. I'm a technician, not royalty or diplomat or anyone with political value to marriage alliances. James forced himself to meet her gaze. Whatever I can offer you isn't worth the political cost of defying your council's expectations. You offer what I need more than clan alliances or political stability, someone who sees me instead of just my throne. Someone I trust completely because you've proven loyalty through action. Serafina's voice carried certainty. James Carter, I know this is complicated and probably inadvisable and definitely going to create political nightmares. But I want you to stay. Not as temporary advisor who returns to Alliance space once the crisis passes. As permanent partner who helps me figure out how to rule differently than my predecessors. James stared at her brain, trying to process implications. Stay on Zephyria, become consort to a queen. Spend whatever remained of his life navigating alien politics and culture. Accept vulnerability and risk loss and open himself to pain. Your council will never accept it, he said, grasping for practical objections. The council will accept what I require them to accept because I just survived conspiracy and coup specifically because I learned to value competence over tradition. Serafina's expression held determination. They want stability. I'll provide stability by demonstrating that my judgment is sound. And part of that stability is having advisors I trust completely. That's not the same as marriage or consort status. No, it's not. which is why I'm not asking you to marry me right now. I'm asking if you're willing to stay long enough to figure out whether what we have is worth fighting political battles for, or whether we're both just processing trauma into something that feels deeper than it actually is. James looked at Danny, seeking perspective. The kid stared back with expression that cycled through concern and encouragement. Sir, you spent 40 years convinced that Rodriguez's death meant you didn't deserve anything beyond maintaining equipment and avoiding connection. Danny's voice carried conviction. Maybe the universe is telling you that was wrong. Maybe Queen Seraphina surviving means something about second chances and choosing to matter instead of just existing. James turned back to Seraphina, searching her expression for certainty or doubt. What he found was patience and hope mixed with exhaustion, a queen who'd survived 3 years of combat, looking at an aging technician like he represented something worth the complications. I need time, he said finally. Time to process everything and figure out whether I'm making decisions based on actual judgment or just responding to danger and proximity. How much time? I don't know. Weeks, maybe months. However long it takes to be certain this isn't just trauma creating temporary attachment. Serafina nodded slowly. Then stay as technical advisor while investigations proceed. Help me rebuild security systems. Work with Danny to train Zephyrian technicians. And while you're doing that, we'll both figure out whether what happened was beginning of something lasting or just intense circumstances creating temporary connection. All right, James said quietly. I'll stay. The next 3 months passed in blur of technical work and political maneuvering. James spent his days rebuilding security protocols with Danny's help, training Zephyrian technicians who'd initially been suspicious of human methods, but gradually accepted that competence transcended species. Spent his evenings in meetings with Seraphina and her senior advisors providing perspective on Alliance operations. Spent his nights in royal quarters processing everything, trying to understand whether he was building toward something meaningful or just temporarily useful. The Planetary Council grudgingly accepted his presence as technical liaison, though several members made clear that permanent foreign advisors remained deeply problematic. Seraphina navigated their concerns with political, skill-balancing tradition against change, maintaining authority while implementing reforms. She was magnificent at it, transforming from Commander Sarah, who led through example, into Queen Seraphina, who ruled through combination of earned respect and inherited authority. James watched her grow into the role with something that felt dangerously close to pride, aware that he was falling harder for someone whose life operated on scales that made his contributions feel simultaneously essential and inadequate. Danny thrived, the kid absorbing Zephyrian technology and culture with enthusiasm that turned technical exchanges into genuine cross-species friendship. He trained alongside Zephyrian engineers, learned their language, became the kind of bridge between cultures that Alliance Diplomatic Corps spent careers trying to develop. You did this, Seraphina said one evening, watching Danny lead a training session. You taught him that competence and curiosity matter more than origin. I just taught him armor repair. He figured out the rest himself. You taught him to care about keeping people alive through technical excellence. Everything else follows from that. She touched his hand, briefly gesture that had become comfortable. James, the council is pressing me about marriage requirements. They want formal announcement within the next month. James felt cold settle in his chest. Have you selected someone from the approved candidate list? No, because I'm not interested in political marriages that serve clan alliances instead of actual partnership. Seraphina's gaze held his. I'm interested in figuring out whether a human technician who saved my life wants to stay permanently, because 3 months of working together has convinced me that what we have is exactly the kind of partnership that makes ruling possible instead of just endurable. Your council will never. My council will accept what I require, just as they accepted investigating Vex despite political complications. Her voice carried certainty earned through successful governance. The question isn't whether they'll accept it. The question is whether you want it. James looked out over the Zephyrian capital city lights, representing billions of lives depending on their queen's judgment. Looked at Danny training the next generation. Looked at Seraphina watching him with expression that held hope and fear mixed equally. Thought about Rodriguez dying because James had been absent. Thought about 23 soldiers who'd lived because he'd been present. Thought about whether redemption was something you earned through perfect technical competence Or something you chose by accepting that presence mattered? Yes, he said finally. I want it. Serafina's expression transformed relief and joy, mixing with determination. She kissed him, then Zephyrian, and human physiology different enough that the gesture required adjustment, but similar enough that the meaning translated perfectly. Danny cheered from across the room, having apparently been eavesdropping, and James felt something unlock in his chest that had been frozen since he was 25. The Planetary Council convened 1 month later to hear Serafina's formal announcement about consort selection. James stood beside her wearing formal attire that Danny had procured, aware that 200 council members were about to experience varying degrees of shock and outrage. Serafina made her announcement with direct clarity, explaining that she'd chosen James Carter as royal consort because he embodied qualities that Zephyria needed: loyalty proven through action, competence that transcended tradition, judgment that valued results over protocol. She acknowledged that her choice was unconventional and would require political accommodation. She also made clear that accommodation was requirement, not request. The debate lasted 6 hours and generated political fallout that would occupy scholars for decades. But eventually, faced with a queen who'd proven her judgment sound and her authority legitimate, the council accepted James's position with conditions about maintaining Zephyrian cultural identity and ensuring succession planning. Morrison attended the ceremony via quantum communication link expression, showing satisfaction that his people had transformed diplomatic crisis into unlikely alliance. He promoted Danny to senior technical specialist and formally requested that Corporal Hayes remain on Zephyria as alliance liaison. The coronation acknowledging James as royal consort happened 1 month later in ceremonies that blended Zephyrian tradition with accommodations for human physiology. James knelt before Serafina in chambers that had witnessed 5 centuries of governance, accepting a circlet that marked him as defender of the realm rather than king title that emphasized his role as protector and advisor. Serafina raised him with hands that were simultaneously gentle and strong. When they stood together before the assembled council and citizens watching via planetary broadcast, James felt weight settling onto his shoulders and that made technical responsibilities look simple. But he also felt purpose that went beyond maintaining equipment connection, that transformed existence from just surviving into actually living second chance at mattering that he'd spent decades convinced he didn't deserve. Ready? Serafina asked quietly. No, James admitted, but I'm here anyway. They walked together through chambers that would define their future human technician and Zephyrian queen partnership that had started with explosion and assassination attempts and evolved into something that looked remarkably like hope. Behind them, Danny documented everything with equipment that would create historical record of the day when Alliance Zephyrian relations shifted from political necessity into something approaching actual trust. Rodriguez had died 40 years ago because James had been 3 clicks away. 23 soldiers had lived because James had been present with skills they needed. Serafina had survived because James had chosen to help. Maybe that was what redemption actually meant. Not perfectly preventing every failure, but showing up for people who needed help and accepting that presence mattered. James Carter, combat medic turned armor technician, turned royal consort, walked beside his queen into a future that terrified and energized him simultaneously, finally accepting that maybe he had been worth saving after all.